May 18, 1565. 230 Ottoman warships appear on the horizon carrying 40,000 soldiers, the best army in the world. Defending Malta, 6,000 men. Most of them farmers who've never held a sword. 6,000 versus 40,000. The math says Malta falls in weeks. The defenders die. The Ottoman Empire controls the Mediterranean and marches on Rome. That's not what happened. Here's how 6,000 crushed 40,000. One 71-year-old commander made a decision so brutal, so calculated, that it would horrify even his own men. He looked at a fort that should hold for 5 days and sent 1,500 soldiers to die there. On purpose. They held for 31 days. And in those 31 days they killed 8,000 Ottomans, elite Janissaries who couldn't be replaced. That single decision broke the math. It turned a suicide mission into a meat grinder that bled an empire faster than it could bleed an island. But here's what nobody tells you. That was just the beginning. The real miracle wasn't the strategy. It was getting 3,000 exhausted men to keep executing it when every instinct screamed to surrender. If you want to see how this actually worked, how one old man's calculation saved Europe, I need your help. Drop a like right now. Comment where you're watching from. It pushes this to more people. Because what you're about to hear will change how you think about leadership, sacrifice, and what humans can endure. The man who made that decision was named Jean Parisot de Valette. And before I show you how his strategy crushed an empire, you need to understand where he learned it. 30 years earlier, Valette had been a slave, captured by pirates, chained to the oar of a Turkish galley for a year, forced to row until his hands bled, sleeping in his own filth, watching men die beside him from exhaustion. But while he was chained to that oar, he learned something the Ottomans didn't want him to learn. He learned how empires think. They calculate victory before the first battle. They commit resources based on expected timelines. They assume resistance will break once the odds become impossible. And if the resistance doesn't break? If it holds 1 day past impossible, then 2 days, then 31 days? The empire starts bleeding resources it can't afford to lose. Valette was ransomed. He returned to the Order of St. John. And he spent 3 decades preparing for the moment when his former captors would come for the island he defended. He studied their tactics, their siege techniques, their psychology. And he built his entire defense around one principle: make them pay more than they're willing to spend. Now, on May 18, 1565, that moment had arrived. The boy who saw them first was named Paulo, 14 years old. A fisherman's son mending nets on the harbor wall when the horizon started changing. A dark line where sky met water, spreading like ink across wet parchment. But the sky was clear. The Mediterranean was glass calm. Storms don't move with that kind of terrible purpose. Paulo dropped his nets and ran. By the time he reached the church of St. Lawrence, the bells were already ringing. Not the call to mass. The alarm that hadn't sounded in living memory. The streets of Burgos flooded with people. Women clutching children. Old men hobbling toward the walls. Young men running toward the armory. Paulo pushed through them all. He climbed the stone steps to the ramparts. 230 galleys stretched across the horizon like a second coastline. 40,000 soldiers coming for a rock defended by 6,000. Standing beside him was Valette, the old knight in battered armor, face seamed with scars, eyes fixed on the approaching darkness. 71 years old, and absolutely calm. He stood motionless as the fleet approached, calculating distances, timelines, probabilities. With the precision of a man who had made peace with death decades ago. Finally, without looking away from the sea, he spoke. "Find your father, boy. Tell him to bring his boat to Fort St. Angelo by nightfall. We'll need every vessel that can carry supplies." Paulo ran. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. The steadiness in Valette's voice, the certainty, and the fear that crept into his chest as he ran through streets that suddenly felt very small, very fragile, very mortal. The shadow had fallen on Malta. Valette had his strategy. But strategy is just theory until real people execute it under real fire. Now you'll see what it actually cost to make 6,000 beat 40,000. Valette already knew they were going to lose. The numbers made it impossible. The defenders had 6,000 total. 500 were Knights of the Order, professional soldiers who had trained their entire lives for war. 4,000 were Spanish and Italian soldiers, experienced but exhausted from campaigns across Europe. 1,500 were Maltese militia, farmers, fishermen, masons, men who knew rope and stone and wood, not the weight of killing. The Ottomans brought 40,000. Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers who had conquered from Budapest to Baghdad. Sipahi cavalry. Engineers who had reduced fortresses from Vienna to Arabia. And cannons. Hundreds of cannons that would pound Malta's limestone walls into dust. The fortifications were impressive. Birgu and Singlia, two fortified towns separated by a narrow harbor. Fort St. Angelo, the ancient stronghold that guarded the entrance to Grand Harbor. And Fort St. Elmo, the star-shaped fortress on the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula. But impressive doesn't mean invincible. Valette had walked every foot of those walls. He knew the weak points, the places where the limestone was crumbling. The bastions that couldn't withstand sustained bombardment. He had done the calculations 100 times and every time the answer was the same. Malta would fall. The only question was when. But here's what the Ottomans didn't understand. Valette wasn't trying to win. He was trying to bleed them slowly enough that they'd give up before Malta drowned in its own blood. On the third day of the siege, Paulu's father was conscripted. Nicola was a fisherman. He had never traveled more than 10 miles from the limestone house where Paulu was born. He had never held a sword. He had lived 43 years without hurting anyone. They handed him an arquebus and told him to report to the walls of Singlia. Paulu watched him march away with 200 other men. Farmers, coopers, chandlers, men whose hands knew honest work, not war. His father stopped before leaving. He looked at Paulu for a long moment. Then he touched the boy's face, his calloused fingers rough against his son's cheek. "Keep your head down," Nicola said. "Do what the knights tell you. And if the Turks break through." He couldn't finish the sentence. He just touched Paulu's face once more. Then he was gone. Paulu stood in the street long after his father disappeared. Around him, Malta was transforming into a fortress. Civilians evacuated to the interior villages. Supplies stockpiled in Fort St. Angelo's magazines. Weapons distributed to anyone who could hold them. The Ottomans landed on May 19th. 10,000 tents spread across the hills like a creeping sickness, covering ground that had been empty farmland a week before. The noise was constant. Drums, horns. The rhythmic chanting of soldiers who had never lost. At night, their cooking fires outnumbered the stars. That's when Paulu learned that war is mostly waiting. He hauled stone. He carried water. He watched the enemy camps grow closer, their trenches snaking toward the walls like roots seeking cracks in limestone. And he tried not to think about his father standing on Senglia's ramparts, holding an arquebus he barely knew how to fire. 2 weeks into the siege, Valette made the decision that would save Malta and condemn 1,500 men to death. Fort St. Elmo had to hold. The star-shaped fort guarded the entrance to Grand Harbor. If it fell quickly, the Ottoman fleet could move into the harbor and bombard Birgu and Singlia from the water. The siege would be over in weeks. But if St. Elmo held, if it could delay the Ottomans for even a few extra days, it would bleed their army. Force them to waste men and ammunition on a secondary target. By time for reinforcements to arrive from Sicily, the military engineers calculated St. Elmo would fall in 5 days. Maybe 7 if the defenders fought hard. Valette sent 1,500 men to hold it. And he told them the truth. "You're going to die there," he said. "But every day you hold costs them blood they can't replace. Every Janissary who dies at St. Elmo won't be at our walls when they come for Birgu." Most people don't know what happened at St. Elmo. If you think you know this story, you don't. Smash that subscribe button right now because what happens next is unbelievable. Paulu was assigned to the supply boats. Every night, when darkness gave them cover, small vessels carried food and ammunition from the magazines in Fort St. Angelo to the outlying positions. St. Elmo was the most dangerous run. Ottoman cannons had been positioned on the heights of Mount Sybaris. During the day they pounded the fort with bombardment that shook the entire island. The first time Paulo made the crossing he counted the impacts. 63 cannon shots in the time it took to row from Angelo to Elmo. By the third night he stopped counting. The knights at St. Elmo were dying by inches. He saw them when he helped unload supplies at the water gate. Exhausted men in dented armor, their faces gray with limestone dust. Their eyes carried a peculiar emptiness that he wouldn't understand until much later. They moved slowly, carefully, like men conserving the last of something precious. They didn't speak unless necessary. They took the water barrels and the lead shot and the bandages with nods of acknowledgement. Then they went back to their positions on walls that were crumbling a little more each day. Commander Luigi Broglia was a compact man with a soldier's economy of movement. Paulo saw him once on the 7th night of the siege, standing at the water gate as supplies were unloaded. His arm was wrapped in bandages stained brown with old blood. His eyes tracked across the barrels with the careful attention of a man rationing the final hours of his life. "Boy," he said. Paulo froze. "Tell the Grand Master that we're grateful for the supplies. Tell him we'll hold as long as we can." Paulo nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Broglia paused. Something flickered across his face. Not fear. Something more like understanding. "And tell him," Broglia stopped. "Tell him that whatever he hears in the coming days, we died well." The crossing back was silent. The other rowers kept their eyes on the water. No one spoke about what Broglia had said. No one needed to. That night, lying on his bedroll in the corner of a crowded warehouse, Paulo understood something he hadn't before. The knights at St. Elmo weren't hoping to survive. They had been sent to that fort knowing they would die. Their only purpose was to die as slowly as possible, buying days and weeks with blood, making the Ottomans pay for every yard of rubble. The Grand Master had looked at a map, done his calculations, and decided that 1,500 men were worth trading for time. That was the arithmetic of sacrifice. Trade lives for days. Trade days for a chance at survival. These men were sent to die. On purpose. 5 days turned into 10. 10 turned into 20. The bombardment never stopped. Paulo made the crossing every night, watching St. Elmo transform from a fortress into a pile of rubble held together by corpses and determination. The Ottomans threw wave after wave at the walls. The defenders met them in the breaches. Fighting hand to hand in spaces so tight that men couldn't swing swords, could only stab and push and die standing up because there was no room to fall. But here's what nobody tells you about St. Elmo. Every day it held was a miracle bought with blood. And the Ottomans were bleeding faster than anyone expected. May turned into June. The fort that should have fallen in a week was still fighting. The rubble piles grew taller. The defenders grew fewer. But the banner of the Order of St. John still flew from the highest point, defiant against the sky. On June 16th, the defenders sent a message to Valette. They were down to their last 100 able-bodied men. Ammunition was nearly gone. The walls were breached in 4 places. They requested permission to abandon the fort and swim across the harbor under cover of darkness. Valette's response was immediate. Hold. Just that. One word. Not a request. Not encouragement. A command. The defenders held. June 23, 1565. St. Elmo fell. Paulo was on the ramparts of Fort St. Angelo when the Ottoman banners rose over the ruins. The bombardment had been constant for weeks. It had become background noise as familiar as breathing. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against the ears like water. It filled spaces that noise had occupied. It felt heavy, final. The knights on the walls crossed themselves. Some wept. A few cursed in languages Paulo didn't understand. But most just stood in that terrible quiet, watching the distant peninsula where the fort had been. 31 days. St. Elmo had held for 31 days against everything the Ottoman Empire could throw at it. The military engineers had calculated 5 days. Maybe a week. Instead, 1,500 men had fought from ruins. They had bled in tunnels. They had died in breaches that they filled with their own bodies until the attackers were climbing over corpses to advance a single yard. 1,500 defenders were dead. But 8,000 Ottomans were dead with them. 8,000. The number seemed impossible. But the evidence was there. The mass graves being dug on Sybaris. The wounded being loaded onto ships for evacuation. The gaps in the Turkish formations where entire units had been erased. Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman commander, stood in the ruins of St. Elmo and looked across the harbor at Burgu. At the main fortifications. At the real target of this siege. According to legend, he said, "If the small son cost us this much, what will the father cost?" The arithmetic was working. But the price was about to get worse. St. Elmo just killed more Ottomans than it had defenders. Valette's terrible calculation had paid off. But now the full weight of the Ottoman army would turn toward Burgu and Singlia. Toward the 3,000 defenders who remained. Toward Paula's father, somewhere on Senglia's walls. And toward Valette himself, who had just proven he was willing to sacrifice anyone, including himself, to hold this rock. Paula was hauling water to the eastern bastion when someone shouted from the harbor side. Then more voices, rising in pitch. Carrying notes of horror that cut through the exhausted numbness that had settled over Burgu. Paula ran to the wall with everyone else. The current had carried them across. Wooden planks. Dozens of them. Each one bearing the mutilated remains of a knight. The bodies from St. Elmo. The men who had held for 31 days. The men who had died buying time with their blood. The Ottomans had decapitated them. They had carved crosses into their flesh. Deep cuts, deliberate, meant to send a message that went beyond simple victory. The bodies were bound to the wooden planks and set adrift as a message that everyone understood. This is what happens to those who resist. Grand Master Valette was already on the wall when Paula arrived. He stood at the edge of the rampart, looking down at the bodies washing against the stones below. His face was carved from the same limestone as the fortifications he defended. No expression. No reaction. Just cold calculation continuing in the mind of a man who had seen worse. Minutes passed. No one spoke. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the harbor wall. The distant rumble of Ottoman drums. The wind moving through the ruined streets of a city that was slowly being ground to dust. Then Valette turned. His voice was quiet. But it carried to every corner of the gathered crowd. "Bring me the prisoners." 20 Turkish soldiers had been captured in raids over the preceding weeks. They were held in the dungeons of St. Angelo, waiting for ransom or exchange. Standard practice in warfare between civilized armies. They were brought up into the courtyard in chains, blinking in the sudden light. Confused by the crowds pressing in from every side, Valette walked down the line of prisoners. He looked at each one, not with hatred. Not with rage, but with the same cold calculation he had shown when the fleet first appeared on the horizon. "Execute them," he said. "Here. Now. Where the enemy can see." Some of the prisoners began to beg. Others stood in silence, understanding what was happening, accepting it with the fatalism of soldiers who had seen too much to expect mercy. The executioner moved down the line with mechanical efficiency. The crowd watched in silence. When it was done, Valette gave his next order. "Load the cannons." They understood. The heads were loaded into the guns. The cannons were elevated toward the Ottoman camp across the harbor. Valette stood on the wall as the guns roared. He watched the grim cargo arc across the water toward the enemy positions. The message was sent. No quarter. No surrender. One of us disappears from history. This wasn't cruelty. This was communication. Both sides understood perfectly, only one would survive this siege. Paula stood on the wall watching. He thought about Brolia's last words. Tell him that whatever he hears in the coming days, we died well. He thought about the crosses carved into the bodies of dead knights. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like growing up all at once, that there would be no negotiation. No terms. No mercy asked or given. The Ottomans had mutilated the dead to break Malta's will. Valette had answered by saying Malta's will could not be broken. The war had just escalated beyond survival. This was now about which side would be completely erased. The stakes had always been that high. Paula just hadn't understood it until now. But if this is blowing your mind, hit that like button right now. And drop a comment. Did Valette make the right call? Because what happens next is even more extreme. The real stakes weren't about the island. Malta was a rock in the Mediterranean. Strategically valuable, yes, but small. With no resources worth conquering except its location. And that location was everything. If Malta fell, the Ottoman fleet would control the Mediterranean. The sea lanes between Christian Europe and the East would be cut. Sicily would be next. Then Italy. Then Rome itself. This wasn't a siege. It was the hinge point of history. The moment when the expansion of the Ottoman Empire would either continue or stop. Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan, understood this. He had sent Mustafa Pasha with clear orders: take Malta, secure the Mediterranean, open the path to the heart of Christian Europe. Valette understood it too. Which is why he couldn't retreat even if he wanted to. There was nowhere to retreat to. If the knights abandoned Malta, they lost their reason for existing. The Order of St. John had been founded to defend Christian pilgrims and territory. If they couldn't hold one small island against any enemy, they were finished. So this was it. The line that couldn't be crossed. The position that couldn't be abandoned. Not because retreat was physically impossible, but because retreat meant something worse than death. It meant admitting that some fights can't be won. That some positions should be surrendered. And once you admit that, you've already lost. Valette had learned this during his year on the Turkish galley. He had watched men give up hope and die within days, their bodies shutting down even though they had strength left. He had watched others endure impossible suffering and survive because they refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. The human body can survive almost anything if the mind decides it will. The question was whether 3,000 men could hold that decision together. Whether they could refuse the rational conclusion that they should surrender. Whether they could keep fighting when every calculation said they were already dead. The Ottomans were about to find out. Spanish relief might come. The Viceroy of Sicily had promised to send an army. But would it arrive before Malta drowned in blood? And even if it did, would there be anyone left to save? Those were the questions that kept Valette awake at night. Paula saw him sometimes, walking the walls at 2 a.m, checking fortifications, speaking quietly with sentries. The old man never seemed to sleep. Never seemed to rest. He was holding Malta together by force of will. And will was the only resource they had left. July brought heat that made war even more unbearable. The Ottomans moved their fleet into Grand Harbor after St. Elmo's fall. They positioned their galleys to support the assault on the main fortifications. 80 cannons now faced Burgu and Singlia. They fired in rotation. Day and night. An endless percussion that made conversation impossible and turned sleep into something closer to unconsciousness. The sound became the texture of existence. It was the first thing Paula heard when he woke. The last thing before he slept. The constant background to every thought, every action, every breath. His world contracted to a series of tasks. Carry water from the wells to the forward positions. Haul ammunition to the walls. Help the surgeons when the wounded came faster than they could be treated. Sleep when you could. Eat what you were given. Stay low when the bombardment intensified. That was existence now. Nothing else. The heat climbed past 40 degrees Celsius. 104 Fahrenheit. Men collapsed from heat stroke in the middle of combat. They fell on the walls and couldn't get up, their bodies shutting down from dehydration and exhaustion. The wells were running dry. Contaminated by debris and bodies that had been thrown down by Ottoman infiltrators. Water was rationed to half a cup per person per day. Not enough to replace what was lost through sweat. Not nearly enough to maintain strength for fighting. The wounded died from infections that the surgeons couldn't treat. There were no clean bandages left. No medicine. Just wine to dull the pain and prayers that meant less every day. The living walked through streets that smelled of rot and smoke and fear. A smell that got into clothes, into skin, into lungs. You couldn't wash it off. You couldn't escape it. Time stopped being measured in days. It was measured in assaults now. Each attack that was repelled or broken through. Each defense that was costly or catastrophic. And the attacks kept coming. July 15th was the first time Paulo saw real combat up close. He was carrying bandages to a forward position when the drums changed. Not the random beating that had become background noise. Something organized, building. A rhythm that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Then the horns. Then the screaming. 10,000 men hit Burgu and Singlia simultaneously. Paulo found shelter in a collapsed building. He pressed himself into the rubble, watching through gaps in the stone as the Ottoman tide crashed against the walls. The defenders met them with arquebus fire. With stones hurled from the ramparts. With boiling oil poured into the ditches where the attackers bunched together. The noise was beyond anything he had imagined. A physical force that seemed to flatten the world into pure sensation. Screaming. Gunfire. The clash of metal on metal. The wet sounds of men dying. Through the chaos he saw the Grand Master. Valette was at the main breach in Burgu's wall. The gap that had been widened by weeks of bombardment until it was 30 feet across. He was in full armor. A two-handed sword in his grip. And he was fighting like a man half his age. 71 years old. Janissaries poured through the breach and he met them blade to blade. Cutting them down. Stepping over bodies. Holding the line with 30 knights while soldiers reformed behind him. A Turkish officer targeted him specifically. The man recognized the Grand Master's armor. He understood that killing Valette would break the defense. Paulo watched the officer charge. Scimitar raised. Screaming something in a language he didn't understand. Valette killed him with a thrust to the chest. Pulled the blade free. Kept fighting. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Just efficient, brutal violence from a man who had been doing this for 50 years. The assault lasted 6 hours. When the Ottomans finally withdrew, the breach was choked with bodies. You couldn't see the ground. Just corpses piled 3 deep in some places, Ottoman and Christian mixed together in death. 500 defenders were dead. 3,000 Ottomans were dead. A 71-year-old man just turned a breach into a graveyard. But the siege was only halfway done. And everyone knew the worst was still coming. That night, Paulo was assigned to body collection. The work was grim. Mechanical. Lifting corpses onto carts. Stripping them of usable equipment. Armor that could be repaired, weapons that could be cleaned, ammunition that could be redistributed. Carrying them to the mass graves outside the walls. He worked until his arms couldn't lift anymore. Then he collapsed against a wall and slept where he fell. When he woke, his father was standing over him. Nicola had crossed from Sanglia during a lull in the bombardment. He carried news that their house had been destroyed by a cannon strike. Everything they owned was gone. The nets, the boat, the tools that had been in the family for 3 generations. But Nicola was alive. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. His face was weathered by exhaustion and fear. New lines around his eyes. Gray in his beard that hadn't been there before. But he was alive. They sat together in the rubble of a stranger's home. They shared a ration of water that tasted like limestone and dust. The knights say relief is coming, Nicola said. From Sicily. The viceroy is assembling a fleet. Do you believe them? Paulo asked. His father was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. Calloused from rope and oars. Now scarred from arquebus recoil and carrying stones. I believe that we don't have a choice, he finally said. So I believe. That was faith. Not certainty. Not evidence. Just the decision to keep going because the alternative was unthinkable. Paulo understood that now. Faith wasn't about knowing you'd survive. It was about choosing hope when hope seemed irrational. His father left before dawn. Crossed back to Singlia under cover of darkness. Paulo watched him go, wondering if he'd ever see him again. Listen, if you're still here, you're why this channel exists. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone. Because what happens in August will test everything you think you know about human endurance. August brought more assaults. August 7th. 10,000 men against the walls. Repelled after 8 hours of fighting. 1,000 defenders wounded or dead. August 12. Another massive assault. The Ottomans brought siege towers this time. Enormous wooden structures that would allow them to attack from the height of the walls instead of below. The defenders burned them with fire pots. But it cost 200 men to get close enough to throw the flames. August 19. The biggest assault yet. 15,000 men hitting every weak point simultaneously. Trying to overwhelm the defense by attacking everywhere at once. The walls held. Barely. The garrison was down to 3,000 effective fighters. Half of them were wounded. All of them were exhausted beyond rational limits. And still they held. Paula saw Valette every day now. The Grand Master walked the walls during the worst bombardments. He stood exposed on the ramparts while cannonballs screamed past, making himself visible to soldiers who needed to see that someone still believed they could survive. He was 71 years old and he moved like a force of nature. Beyond fear. Beyond doubt. Carrying a certainty that seemed to flow into everyone around him. But Palu also saw the private moments. He was delivering a message to Fort St. Angelo when he glimpsed the Grand Master in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. His head bowed. His hands clasped together. The old man was utterly still. His lips were moving silently. In the dim light, he didn't look like the terrible warrior who held breaches with his sword. He looked like a tired old man praying to a god he wasn't sure was listening. Paula backed away without making a sound. That night, lying in the darkness, he thought about what he had seen. He had watched Valette send men to die at St. Elmo. He had seen him order the execution of prisoners. He had witnessed him fight with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. The Grand Master was a legend. A symbol. A figure of impossible strength. But he was also a man. A man who prayed in empty chapels. Who carried the weight of decisions that killed thousands. Who had to keep believing in victory when every rational calculation said they should have lost months ago. That was leadership. Not the absence of doubt. But the refusal to let doubt stop you. And Paulu understood something else. Something that Valette had learned during that year as a slave on the Turkish galley. Empires assume they've already won before the fight is finished. They calculate victory based on numbers and resources. They commit to campaigns expecting resistance to collapse once the odds become clear. But if the resistance doesn't collapse, if it holds past the point where collapse should be inevitable, the empire starts bleeding resources it can't replace. Every Janissary who died at St. Elmo was a soldier who couldn't be replaced. The Ottoman Empire was vast, yes. But it was also stretched across 3 continents. Fighting wars in Persia and Hungary in North Africa. The 40,000 soldiers at Malta weren't unlimited. Every loss hurt. And they had lost 8,000 at St. Elmo alone. That was Valette's strategy. Not to win. Just to refuse to lose until the Ottomans decided the cost was too high. It was working. But would it work fast enough? Paula closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he didn't dream of dying. He dreamed of his father's face. Of their house before the war. Of the sound of waves against a fishing boat in water that wasn't filled with corpses. And he slept. September 6, 1565. The Ottoman trenches had been pushed to the very edge of Burga's walls. Close enough that defenders could hear the enemy soldiers talking. Close enough to smell their cooking fires. The siege bridges were in position. Massive wooden structures that would span the final gap between the trenches and the walls. 25,000 soldiers were massing in the forward positions. Everyone knew what was coming. The final assault. The attack that would end this one way or another. Valette called his last council of war that morning. Paula wasn't present, but he heard about it later from a knight who was. The Grand Master laid out the plan for a fighting retreat. When the walls were breached, not if, but when, the defenders would fall back to Fort St. Angelo. They would make their last stand in the ancient stronghold. They would fight to the last man. No evacuation. No escape. The Order of St. John would die on Malta or it would survive on Malta. There was no third option. The council ended in silence. The knights filed out. They went to their positions. They checked their weapons. They made peace with God or fate or whatever they believed was waiting on the other side. And they waited for the drums. Paolo was assigned to the harbor wall. His job was to watch for signals from the forward positions, to relay messages to the command post when the assault began. It was early afternoon. The heat was crushing. The air felt thick enough to choke on. He watched the Ottoman camp. Watched the soldiers forming up. Watched the banners being raised. The drums beginning their steady rhythm. This was it. The end of everything. Then a sound cut through the heat and the drums and the terrible waiting. Hoofbeats. A rider was coming from the north, riding his horse like the world was ending, like nothing else mattered except the message he carried. The guards at the gate tried to stop him. He pushed through, leaped from his saddle, ran toward the command post. He was screaming something. Paula couldn't make out the words at first. The rider was out of breath, covered in dust. His voice was breaking from exhaustion. But then Paula heard it. Ships. Ships from the north. Spanish banners. Don Garcia has landed with an army. The words didn't make sense. Relief. The Spanish relief force. The army that might come someday, maybe if they were lucky. It was here. Now. Landing at Melilla Bay on the north coast of the island. The news spread through Burgu like fire through dry grass. Men who had accepted death minutes ago were suddenly shouting, embracing, falling to their knees in prayer. The church bells began to ring. Not the alarm they had tolled in May. Something closer to celebration. Paula climbed to the highest point he could reach. He looked north toward Melilla Bay. The hills blocked his view. He couldn't see the Spanish fleet, but he could see the Ottoman camp, and he could see chaos. Tents were being struck, not in orderly fashion, frantically. Soldiers were abandoning forward positions, running back to the main camp. The siege bridges that had been positioned for the final assault were being dismantled. Cannons that had been firing for months were being hauled away from the walls. The organized efficiency of the Ottoman army was unraveling into something that looked like panic. They were leaving. After 4 months. After 30,000 dead on both sides. After sacrifices that should have been beyond human endurance. The Ottomans were just leaving. Paula didn't believe it. None of them believed it. They kept watching, waiting for it to be a trick, a feint, some kind of tactical maneuver. But it wasn't. The Ottoman army was retreating, pulling back from the walls, loading supplies onto ships, preparing for evacuation. Mustafa Pasha had done the calculation. His army was exhausted. He had lost 8,000 men at St. Elmo. Another 20,000 in the assaults on Burgu and Singlia. The soldiers who remained were worn down by heat, disease, and endless combat against an enemy that refused to break. And now a fresh Spanish army had landed behind him. He was caught between two forces. A garrison that had proven it would fight to the last man. And reinforcements that would cut off his retreat if he waited too long. Pride wasn't worth losing everything. The decision was made. The siege was over. It took 3 days for it to become real. The Spanish relief force never actually reached Burgu. By the time Don Garcia's army marched south from Melilla, the last Ottoman galley was already clearing the harbor. The Spanish numbered about 8,000 men. Fresh troops. Well supplied. Ready for battle. They never fired a shot. The Ottomans were gone before they arrived. Sailed away into history. Left behind their siege equipment, their dead, and the ruins of an empire's reputation. September 8, 1565. The Feast of the Nativity of Our Lady. The Siege of Malta officially ended. Paolo was standing on the walls of Fort St. Angelo when the last Turkish sails disappeared over the horizon. The silence that followed was not like the silence after St. Elmo fell. That had been heavy with grief. A silence of loss. This silence was different. It was the silence of people who had expected to die and somehow hadn't. The silence of men and women trying to comprehend that they were still breathing, still standing, still alive. Beside Paolo, an old knight crossed himself. Tears ran down his face. He didn't bother to wipe them away. Paolo looked across the harbor, at the shattered walls, the collapsed buildings, the mass graves that dotted every open space. 7,000 defenders were dead. More than half of everyone who had stood on these walls in May. His neighbors were gone. His friends. The fishermen who had worked alongside his father. Most of them were buried in pits outside the walls, their names forgotten, their faces already fading from memory. But Malta remained. The island was still Christian, still free, still standing. And somehow, against every calculation, against every rational expectation, Paolo was still alive too. His father emerged from Singlia 2 days later. Nicola was thinner, grayer. He walked with a limp from a wound that hadn't healed properly. But he was alive. They stood together on the harbor wall, father and son, looking at the ruins of everything they had known. "We held," Nicola said. His voice was quiet, wondering. "We held," Paolo agreed. They didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. Malta had been the rock that would not break. And they had been part of that rock. That was enough. 3 years later. August 1568. Paolo was 17 now. No longer a boy. The siege had taken care of that. He worked as a mason on the new fortifications. The skills he had learned hauling rubble during the bombardments had translated easily into honest labor. He knew stone. He knew how walls should be built. He knew where the weak points were because he had watched them crumble under cannon fire. The city rising on the Sybaris Peninsula was named Valletta, after the Grand Master who had saved the island. The walls were 30 feet thick. The bastions covered every approach. The entire city was designed as a fortress, engineered so that what happened in 1565 could never happen again. It was impregnable, and for centuries it would remain that way. Paolo was working on the southern wall when someone shouted that the Grand Master had collapsed. Valette had been inspecting the construction. He did that constantly, walking the works, checking measurements, questioning engineers, making sure that every stone was placed correctly. He was 74 years old. He should have been resting, enjoying whatever peace an old warrior could find. But Valette didn't know how to rest. He had spent his entire life fighting. And even in peacetime he was still fighting, against time, against complacency, against the possibility that Malta might not be ready when the next enemy appeared. He collapsed while examining a bastion. Just fell. One moment he was standing. The next he was on the ground. They carried him to his quarters in the new city that bore his name. He died that night. 74 years old. Surrounded by knights who had bled beside him in the breaches. Who had watched him fight at 71 like a man possessed. Who had followed him because they believed that if he could stand, they could stand too. The warrior had finally rested. Paolo didn't attend the funeral. He wasn't important enough. He was just a mason. A fisherman's son who had carried water during the siege and somehow survived. But he watched the procession from a rooftop. The endless line of knights in ceremonial armor. Their faces solemn. Their movements precise. Honoring the man who had saved them all. The Maltese civilians lined the streets in silence. Thousands of them. Men and women and children who existed because Valette had refused to surrender. The Pope had sent a blessing. The King of Spain had sent condolences. Dignitaries from every Christian court in Europe sent representatives. But the greatest tribute was the city itself. Valletta. Rising from the rock where so many had died. Built to be eternal. A monument in stone to the man who had proven that will could overcome numbers. The tomb was simple. Simpler than Paolo expected for a man of such legend. The inscription read, "Here lies Valette, worthy of eternal honor. He who was once the scourge of Africa and Asia and the shield of Europe." Scourge and shield. Warrior and protector. Slave and grand master. A man who had been chained to Turkish oars and used that experience to understand his enemy well enough to defeat them. Every year after that, on September 8th, Paolo visited the tomb. He didn't pray there. He wasn't sure what he believed about God or heaven or the afterlife. The siege had complicated his faith in ways he couldn't explain. But he stood in silence. And he remembered. He remembered the shadow on the sea. That first sight of 230 galleys transforming the horizon. He remembered Brolya's words at the water gate. Tell him we died well. He remembered his father's face in the rubble of a stranger's home. The decision to believe because there was no choice. He remembered Valette kneeling alone in the chapel. An old man praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. And he remembered the lesson that Malta had taught him. Not in words, but in blood and stone and endurance. Some positions cannot be abandoned. Not because retreat is physically impossible, but because abandoning them opens doors that can never be closed again. Some fights have to be fought even when the numbers say you'll lose. Because surrendering without fighting means admitting that some causes aren't worth dying for. And once you admit that, you've already lost everything that matters. 6,000 against 40,000. Farmers and fishermen against Janissaries, the elite soldiers who had conquered half the known world. Limestone walls against bronze cannons that could reduce fortresses to rubble. The math said Malta should have fallen. Should have surrendered. Should have accepted the inevitable. But the stone held. That was the miracle. Not divine intervention. Not superior tactics. Not even the Spanish relief that arrived too late to matter. The miracle was the decision, made every single morning by 3,000 exhausted men, to keep fighting when fighting seemed insane. Valette knew the math was impossible. He ignored it. Paula knew he might die. He carried water anyway. 1,500 knights died at St. Elmo knowing they were sacrificed for time. And they died anyway. Because some positions can't be abandoned. That's what stopped the Ottoman Empire at its peak. Not walls. Not weapons. Not even faith in the traditional sense. Just the absolute refusal to break. And in that refusal, something was proven that could never be disproven. That numbers don't guarantee victory. That determination can outweigh calculation. That the human spirit, committed to a position it will not abandon, can stop the tide of history itself. The man who was once a slave in Turkish chains became the shield that stopped an empire. But the real miracle wasn't one man. It was what he proved was possible when people refused to accept that they're already beaten. Malta's defense stopped Ottoman expansion permanently. The Mediterranean was secured for Christian powers. 6 years later, at the Battle of Lepanto, a Christian fleet defeated the Ottoman navy, emboldened by Malta's example. Inspired by the proof that the invincible could be defeated. History's trajectory shifted on that limestone rock. And the shift began with one old man's decision that some calculations don't matter. You can lose and still win if you make the enemy pay more than they're willing to spend. That was the legacy. That was the lesson written in the stones of Valletta. That was what Paolo passed down to his children, and they to theirs, until it became more than history. It became identity. Malta had been the rock that would not break. And empires had shattered against it. 60 years after the siege, Paolo was an old man. 72 years old. The same age Valette had been when he stood on the walls watching the Ottoman fleet arrive. He told stories to grandchildren who could barely imagine the world he was describing. They had grown up in Valletta. Behind 30-foot walls. In a city built to be impregnable. They knew the siege only as legend. As the founding myth of their identity. They didn't know what it felt like to watch 230 galleys appear on the horizon. To understand that death was coming and there was nowhere to run. They didn't know what it felt like to carry water under cannon fire. To stack bodies in carts. To watch your father march away with an arquebus he didn't know how to fire. They didn't know the smell. The heat. The exhaustion that went beyond physical into something that broke your mind. But Paula knew. And he remembered. Birgu had been rebuilt. Sanglia had been rebuilt. Valletta stood proud on the peninsula where Fort St. Elmo once held for 31 impossible days. The island was whole again. Stronger than before. Protected by fortifications that would stand for centuries. But Paolo still visited the mass graves every September 8th. Simple stones marking the places where thousands were buried. No names. No individual markers. Just collective remembrance for the men and women who had refused to break. He stood there. An old man remembering when he was 14. When the world was ending. When every day was a choice to continue or give up. And he understood something that his grandchildren couldn't yet understand. The siege hadn't just been about Malta. It had been about proving something fundamental about human nature. That we can endure more than we think we can. That the limits we imagine aren't real. That the only true defeat is the decision to stop fighting. Valette had understood this. He had learned it chained to an or on a Turkish galley. Had learned that the body could survive almost anything if the mind refused to surrender. And he had used that knowledge to save an island. To stop an empire. To change the course of history. Not because he was superhuman. But because he was willing to make decisions that required other people to die. And because those people were willing to die once they understood what was at stake. That was the true story of Malta. Not a miracle. Not divine intervention. Just humans deciding that some things matter more than survival. Paula died in 1623. Aged 72. He was buried in the cemetery outside Valletta. In a grave marked with a simple stone. No titles. No honors. No inscription beyond his name and the years of his life. Just one of 7,000 stories from a siege that changed the world. But he had been there. He had carried water and hauled stone and watched the horizon burn. He had seen the shadow fall and he had seen it lift. He had been part of the stone that would not break. And that, in the end, was enough. You started this video watching numbers that didn't make sense. 6,000 defeating 40,000 shouldn't be possible. But now you understand. It wasn't about numbers. It was about the decision made every single day to not surrender. Valette knew the math was impossible. He ignored it. He calculated that bleeding the Ottomans slowly was worth more than preserving his own army. And he was right. Paula knew he might die carrying supplies across a harbor under cannon fire. He did it anyway. Because someone had to. 1,500 knights died at St. Elmo knowing they were sent there to buy time with their lives. And they held for 31 days instead of 5. Because some positions can't be abandoned. That's what stopped the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power. Not superior weapons. Not better fortifications. Not even the Spanish relief that arrived after the Ottomans had already decided to leave. Just the refusal to break. The absolute, uncompromising refusal to accept that the fight was already lost. And in that refusal they proved something that still matters today. That determination can outweigh calculation. That the human spirit, committed to a position it will not abandon, can stop forces that should be unstoppable. Malta was the rock that would not break. And 500 years later we're still talking about why that mattered. Because it changed everything that came after. The Mediterranean was secured. The Ottoman expansion stopped. Europe survived. All because an old man who had been a slave decided that some calculations don't matter. If this story changed how you think about history, about leadership, about what humans can endure when everything's on the line, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because I'm bringing you more stories like this. Moments where history turned on decisions that seemed impossible. Where ordinary people did extraordinary things because they refused to accept the limits everyone else saw. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's facing their own impossible odds. Someone who needs to be reminded that the limits we see aren't always real. And drop a comment. I want to know what you think. What would you have done at that breach on July 15th? Would you have stood with Valette at 71 years old, sword in hand, holding the line against 10,000 men? Or does survival instinct trump everything else? Would you have volunteered for St. Elmo knowing you were being sent to die? Would you have made Valette's choice? Trading 1,500 lives for time? These aren't easy questions. There are no right answers. But they're worth thinking about. Because these stories aren't just about the past. They're about what humans are capable of when there's no way out except through. They're about the decisions we make when every option is terrible and we have to choose anyway. They're about leadership that doesn't guarantee survival but guarantees meaning. Malta held. Against odds that should have been impossible. Against an empire at its peak. Against every rational calculation. The stone held. And that's something worth remembering. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.